Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Chris Steyerwalt.
And I'm Eliana Johnson.
Welcome to Ink Stained Wretches, El Wretchos to its friends, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And Eliana Johnson, I want to use this incredibly powerful platform and our deep reach across this great nation to share a public service announcement. My eldest man-child will be driving next year, and I'm thinking very much about that and rules for driving. And we live in a place where, looking at you, Maryland, some of the worst drivers in America ply their trade on the congested roads of the Washington, D.C. metro area. And I have lit on two rules that are, I'm sure, deeply informed by my personal Christian faith for driving. Number one, if you screw up when you're driving, you're in the wrong lane, you missed a turn, whatever, you have to eat it, right? You cannot block the rest of traffic. You cannot swerve across three lanes. You cannot try to turn left from the right lane. You have to eat it and drive around, even if it makes you late. And the second is like it, which is if someone is doing wrong, right? If someone is not obeying the first commandment of driving, you must allow them in. You must let them merge. You must let them get over. By these measures, only can you keep yourself safe and be respectful of other drivers. Here endeth the lesson.
Can I make a separate comment about the advancing technology in cars before we get into it? I have been doing a lot of travel recently, and hence I've been in several rental cars. I hate lane assist, where, you know, this technology that keeps you in, supposed to keep you in your own lane, and it automatically like redirects you. Right? If you veer off the straight line of your own lane, it is the most jarring. This thing has to be causing accidents. It petrifies me. And then because it's a rental car, I don't know how to turn it off.
Which version did you find most odious? Which car maker?
Any kind, any type of it. I had one in an Audi and one in a Jeep or something. It was horrible.
The Jeep one is bad.
Oh my gosh.
It's alarming, and you're fighting it. And if you're not familiar with it, but I will also say that I've had it in some vehicles, rented wait, I'm sorry. I have it backwards. The Jeep one was good. I rented a Jeep over the summer for a vacation trip. And that one was less jarring, but some of them, yes. When you get the haptic buzz on the steering wheel, it's alarming, and then you're fighting it while you're driving.
It's horrible. All right, let's get into it. I had just a general comment. You know, I'm looking at the front page of the Washington Post today, and we're recording on Friday morning. Blinken in Israel to urge humanitarian pause. The New York Times, same thing. As Gaza war enters new phase, Israel faces pressure over civilian deaths. Blinken backs Israel while pushing for more aid in Gaza. My thought on this, Chris, was just, it is so indicative of, in the press, the backwards understanding of this. Why, both in our politicians and our press, is the pressure on Israel rather than on Hamas, which could also end the war, return the hostages? Why is it not calls on Hamas to return hostages, lay down arms, and surrender to save civilians in Gaza? All of the pressure, all of the coverage is about Israel, the civilian deaths hung around Israel's neck, when in reality, every one of the civilian casualties in this war is the fault of Hamas. And never, never is it covered that way in the mainstream press.
Well, I think the first, in the light most favorable to the defendant, there is an inequality in capacity here. which is that you know what Hamas is because they say it, right? They go on, their spokespeople go on television and say, oh yeah, we're going to do many more October 7th. This is our purpose. This is one of my favorites was a Hamas representative was asked, why don't you let the women and children shelter in your tunnel network from the air attacks? And the answer is, well, no, we need those to kill Israelis, right? We have to kill Jews, and we need the tunnels to fight the war, so they can't come down there. So if you were looking at, okay, who could be politically pressured, there's no pressuring Hamas, right? They're barbaric. And so you can politically pressure Israel, which has a democratic system and elected leaders and does all that. You can't with Hamas. The other thing, of course, is, and we saw this in the Cold War frequently, we talk in the media a lot about equivocation or false equivalency, and you very often hear it. I think recently Chuck Todd was doing an interview at Harvard, and he was like, we need to be objective. We need to be objective. We need to be objective. And then he said, except for with Republicans, right? Because they're bad. And we know they're bad. But in everything else, we should try to be fair. The movement in the media against false equivalency or both sidesism, journalistic scholars and pundits talk a lot about that from the progressive point of view, talking about domestic politics. And yet they cannot seem to see it when it comes to this conflict, right? Here's a case where false equivalency matters and where treating these two entities as the same is unacceptable, in the same way that during the Cold War, it was unacceptable to say, the Soviets, the Americans, not a dime's worth of difference really when you get down to it. It's just a conflict between superpowers, as opposed to acknowledging the dishonesty, brutality, and inhumanity of Soviet communism. And I think I think that blame America first knee-jerk reaction carries over to Israel because of the close connection between Israel and the United States.
I actually think it's worse than that, in that they're not treating them equivalently. They are making demands of Israel that they would never make of Hamas. They are blaming Israel for things for which they are not blaming Hamas, hanging civilian casualties around Israel's neck, and not pointing out that actually this is a deliberate tactic by Hamas with which to shame, humiliate, apply pressure to Israel. It's a political tactic on their part. They have no reverence for human life. And if the media were covering this accurately, they would note that the civilian casualties are Hamas's civilian casualties, not Israel's.
Well,
so I think it's worse than putting them on the same plane.
It is compounded by the infantilization of Hamas, right? And saying, because we have a really interesting piece on this about colonialism and all of this stuff. But if you start with the premise that everything Hamas does is really Israel's fault because of the conditions in which the people in their jurisdiction live, then you can say, okay, well, they can't do anything about it. And we certainly saw it with the Taliban. We've seen it again and again, which is for people who say, well, they're children, right? Basically treating them like children instead of giving them agency.
Let's get into the actual articles. This caught my attention. We've seen, and we're going to get to one in my obsession, this tendency to hair split, which I think is a desire to, the hair splitting is a way to minimize what Hamas has done here. But the Washington Post's Glenn Kessler decided to fact check. The headline is Biden's dismissal of the reported Palestinian death toll. So he's going to fact check how accurate Hamas's death toll numbers are. So Glenn Kessler writes, Biden's dismissal of the ministry's statistics that he had, quote, no confidence in them was striking. The State Department has regularly cited ministry statistics without caveats in its annual human rights reports. Must be right then, Kessler continues, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, real hotbed of Zionism there, which tracks deaths in the conflict, has found the ministry's numbers to be reliable after conducting its own investigation. Past experience indicated that the tolls were reported with high accuracy, a UN official told the fact checker. With any numbers, there are caveats. Questions have also been raised about the ministry's statistics after a still murky incident at the Al-Ali hospital was said to have killed nearly 500 people. So let's explore whether Biden's opinions of the statistics has a factual basis. I mean, first of all, the incident around the hospital is not still murky. I think we know pretty accurately what happened, but this to me is just, it's so indicative of what's happening in the press and is the fact checker equivalent of did Hamas behead 40 babies or 35 babies? And did they behead them or were they just found with severed heads?
Yeah, another great moment in fact check journalism. Another pinnacle moment.
What do we have next here? Oh, this New York Times.
Rothman here, our friend Noah Rothman deserves credit here for finding and seizing upon, really could be a facile, but the great New York Times headline, fantastic. After years of vowing to destroy Israel, Iran faces a dilemma. It's tough, right? I mean, put yourself in the Iranian shoes. Subhead, with Israel bent on crushing Iran's ally Hamas, Tehran must decide whether it and the proxy militias it arms and trains will live up to its fiery rhetoric. I gotta say, to do this is a sort of like, it's the sort of piece you would do about a newly elected president or a member of the Congress, in which you'd say, well, they talk this way on the campaign trail, but can they deliver? And it's a doozy. I'll read a little bit from Noah here. What, quote, dilemma is that, you wonder? The subhead clarifies. To put the proposition in plainer terms, Iran's predicament seems to be that it has incubated a variety of bloodthirsty terrorist groups in the region, all of whom have promised to kill as many Jews as possible. But now, with Hamas having demonstrated that the mass slaughter of Israeli Jews is possible and the Gaza war in full swing, will Iran and its proxies make good on their pledge? The mind reels. Once again, the something here is the murder of Israelis and Americans. Is that an undeniable outcome? We don't get the sense of that from the author's bloodless copy. And right on, Noah Rothman.
Speaking of bloodless copy, Chris, my head exploded when I read the following. The New York Times, also, we have a real banner of New York Times coverage here, had a piece. And of course, as always, we will link all of these in our newsletter. Who decides Penn's future? Donors or the university? Some alumni want the president to resign. They're angry about a Palestinian conference and Penn's response to the Hamas attacks, as well as DEI and transgender rights. And the piece is about the top donors to the University of Pennsylvania pulling their funding over Penn's reaction to the terrorist attacks on Israel. But weeks before this happened, there was a conference hosted by the university called the Palestine Rights Conference. And one of the guests at the conference was the Pink Floyd frontman Roger Waters, who is a noxious anti-Semite and has dressed as a Nazi in costume. He has hung from the ceiling, from the rafters at his concerts, an inflatable pig with a Nazi insignia on it. And his hostility to Jews and the Jewish state is well documented over the decades. And the way that the New York Times wrote about who Roger Waters is and the anti-Semitism he has expressed made my head explode. Talking about bloodless prose. So this is in reference to objections to the Palestine Rights Conference, where this anti-Semitism was expressed in an event sponsored by and held at the University of Pennsylvania. So the Times writes, the donors, quote, cited a range of speakers that they considered objectionable. They noted, for instance, the presence of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen, a vocal supporter of the movement to boycott, divest from and sanction Israel, known as BDS, and they objected to Roger Waters, the Pink Floyd musician, who had worn a Nazi-like costume in a Berlin concert, which he said was intended as a statement against fascism. Period.
Obviously.
No further comment.
Obviously. What else could it mean, right? He was kidding. He JK, right? Just
the idea that you would give him the benefit of the doubt, cite his rebuttals, and not simply refer to him as what he is, which is an anti-Semite, is appalling, and so revealing of what's happening at this paper.
less good news to report today.
We're moving to good news.
Here's
though.
a great piece. I don't know if you are familiar with Simon Montefiore, the British historian and author. If you are not, I highly recommend his book, Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar. If you're into Kremlinology and Russian history, as I am, a great piece. And The Atlantic published an essay from Montefiore that deserves your attention. The decolonization narrative is dangerous and false, says The Atlantic's headline. And what Montefiore says is, I want to find just the right passage, but basically he wanted to see whether, how would people respond, what would the intellectual community's response to the Hamas attack and the ensuing conflict be? And what he found, of course, was here, let me read. I always wondered about the leftist intellectuals who supported Stalin and those aristocratic sympathizers and peace activists who excused Hitler. Today's Hamas apologists and atrocity deniers, what with their robotic denunciations of settler colonialisms, belong to the same tradition, but worse. They have abundant evidence of the slaughter of old people, teenagers, and children, but unlike those fools of the 1930s who slowly came around to the truth, they have not changed their views an iota. The lack of decency and respect for human life is astonishing. Almost instantly after the Hamas attack, a legion of people emerged who downplayed the slaughter or denied actual atrocities had even happened, as if Hamas had just carried out a traditional military operation against soldiers. October 7th deniers, like Holocaust deniers, exist in an especially dark place. Important words, important to remember. And it just points to the value of knowing history, studying history, finding those parallels when they exist. And what Montefiore does here so brilliantly is teases out how, as we were talking about at the beginning, during the Cold War, the false equivalencies between the United States and the Soviet Union, how it happens again and again in the intellectual community, and they never tire of it. It never ends.
How do we transition from that to Taylor Lorenz, Chris?
Another intellectual.
From Simon Sebag Montefiore to Taylor Lorenz.
Yes. Well, Taylor Lorenz, one of the great thinkers of our time.
Oh, my goodness. Our friend John McCormick at National Review notes that Taylor Lorenz, and actually we should link the Washington Free Beacon's wonderful review of her new book. So our friend John McCormick at National Review notes that her first Washington Post article after the October 7th massacre in Israel promoted the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist website Mondoweiss, and Lorenz signal boosted the following. Many details of what transpired on October 7th continue to be shrouded in mystery, including how the 1,400 Israelis who died that day were killed. It's hard to know, when they videotaped it all. A growing number of reports indicate the Israeli military was responsible for some of those deaths. So this is the website she's signal boosting, and she writes in her column, posting to her own account and that of Mondoweiss, a news outlet covering the region from a Palestinian perspective, her latest videos have amassed a collective 1.2 million views. That is from Lorenz's piece.
Just a perspective,
again,
just covering it from a Palestinian perspective.
Sickening.
Yeah, it's just fair.
Sickening.
Just about it. Just about viewpoints. I will just say again, how long can the Washington Post employ Taylor Lorenz? How long?
Chris, let's talk 2024.
Let's do it.
And I wanted to add a personal note to this and link something that my dad wrote. But the campaign of Dean Phillips, the Minnesota congressman, is attracting attention because he's a Democrat who's primarying Joe Biden. And he is also our cousin, my cousin, and my dad's cousin. And my dad wrote a lovely essay note on his blog Powerline about this that I wanted to direct people to. But that's a note just in terms of our conversations about it and our coverage about it at the Beacon. Of course, we have no negative words to say about family members. I have only the most wonderful things to say about Dean. And my dad wrote the following before Dean launched his campaign. Dean hasn't told me and I haven't asked, but I believe the reason Dean called for a Democratic challenger to Biden is obvious. Dean diplomatically frames it in terms of the need for generational change. Like the little boy in the tale of the emperor's new clothes, he must see what his Democratic colleagues are otherwise afraid to say. As he mounts a challenge to Biden from inside the party, his conscience will be clear. I'm not so sure about his Democratic colleagues. And at the end, of course, my dad and I, who have a similar view on world affairs, don't share Dean's politics, but we've shared many holidays with him and his family. And my dad wrote, and I echo that, as he tests the waters in New Hampshire, I hope Dean can do for Biden what then Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy did for LBJ in the 1968 New Hampshire primary. As a partisan Republican, let me put it this way. This is one campaign in which I support Dean without any mental reservation.
And there is a big media story around Dean Phillips.
Excuse me, that was actually my dad.
Oh, perfect timing.
Good guy. His ears must have been burning.
There is a big media story around the Dean Phillips, because obviously the Dean Phillips candidacy is a media-facing it's a New Hampshire-facing candidacy, but it's a media-facing candidacy. And he needs to get attention in his bid, but not have the entire left-wing media apparatus come down on him in the way that they did with RFK Jr. Now, he's a very different kind of candidate than RFK Jr. And he is most notable for his centrism, right? He is expressly moderate, from a moderate district, and he is all about that. And I read
we should note he defeated a Republican when he won, and he's in one of these districts that turned from Republican to Democrat in the Trump era. And I would say he's a partisan Democrat, but on the center left, and notably got into a tangle in the Trump era with the Squad, has a contentious relationship with his fellow Minnesota Democrat Ilhan Omar. And I think that's sort of a good way to describe where he is. He's a pro-Israel Democrat.
Yes. And Greg Sargent, a pro-Democrat columnist at the Washington Post, did an interview with him and wrote it up. And I want to read to you a little passage here. Representative Phillips has insisted Biden's failure to secure the U.S.-Mexico border constitutes one of their deepest differences. So I asked what he'd do instead. He supports a bipartisan bill to dramatically speed up the processing of asylum cases while holding all applicants in humanitarian campuses, with very few released into the interior. The bill would give legal status to many undocumented immigrants already in the United States and broaden legal pathways for still more to apply from afar. Phillips also supports creating large centers in Central America where asylum cases can be adjudicated without a trek to the border, with dormitories where applicants can remain safe, a somewhat novel notion. He'd pair this with new limits on who can seek asylum after arriving here. Now, Sargent pins him. He goes on to Sargent defends Biden and says, well, Biden wants to do stuff, but Republicans won't let him. And Sargent takes credit for pressuring Phillips to finally say, yes, Republicans are more to blame than, he said, pressed on whether he acknowledges that the GOP is the bigger problem. Phillips replied, yes. So here's what I thought after reading this. If I wanted to be the no labels nominee, or have they're weird about it, but basically to get the no labels line for the presidential nomination, this might not be a bad way to do it, right? And as you read through the way that Phillips handles these questions, his outreach isn't that much within the Democratic Party, right? He's obviously talking to other people. Now, that can help him with independents in New Hampshire who could come in and vote in the primary, but I'm seeing something here. So I want to just put a little note on that and say, well, I'll be interested to see how it goes. Okay. You flagged this New York Times piece, how Trump's verbal slips could weaken his attacks on Biden's age.
The New York Times doing President Biden's bidding writes how Trump's verbal slips could weaken his attacks on Biden's age. Donald Trump, 77, has relentlessly attacked President Biden, 80, as too old for office. But the former president himself has had a series of gaffes that go beyond his usual freewheeling style. And they note how President Trump, does a funny impression of Joe Biden with droopy eyelids and mouth agape. Mr. Trump stammers and mumbles. He squints. His arms flap. He shuffles his feet and wanders laggardly across the stage. A burst of laughter and applause erupts from the crowd as he feigns confusion by turning and pointing to invisible supporters as if he does not realize his back is to them. But his recent campaign events have also featured less deliberate stumbles. Mr. Trump has had a string of unforced gaffes, garble, and general disjointedness that go beyond his usual discursive nature, and that his Republican rivals are pointing to as signs of his declining performance. Chris, we have talked about this before. 2024, that's going to be the year when Donald Trump says something and does something that's beyond the pale. This is really reminiscent of, remember when there was a huge media firestorm about Donald Trump holding the handle when he walked down the stairs of Air Force One? Like, Donald Trump's weakness is he's old. It's not going to be that he says something senile. He's crazy. He's not senile.
Well, I have to say, I mean, stipulating the we're really in the false equivalency vein today, but stipulating what you say about carrying water for Biden. This is, I think, a good piece, and I think a directionally correct piece. Trump is goofy and he's confused, and it's not. They quote Ronnie D saying, "This is a different Donald Trump than 2015 or 2016. Lost the zip off his fastball," DeSantis told reporters. In 2016, he was freewheeling. He's out there barnstorming the country. Now it's just a different guy. And it's sad to see. It is. Here's the Trump challenge. He's running against, in the Republican primary, he's running against Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, sure. But he's also eventually running against himself. He's running against the version of himself. And Trump has been running a courthouse campaign in which basically Joe Biden and the Justice Department and Fani Willis are doing the work for Trump, because Republicans see this as a conflict. They're going to stand by their guy against what they see as unfair attacks. But I do think that there's something to the more that Trump's out there and the more that Trump's campaigning and the more that he's doing it, he is different, right? It's not, he's not as good. He's not the same. He still certainly has the gift, but I think he does have to deal with the shadow between Trump 1.0 and Trump 3.0.
What I've observed is the following, and I just listened to the audio interview that he did with the Free Beacon last weekend at the Republican Jewish Coalition. I wouldn't call them misstatements or gaffes. They don't appear to me to be the result of declining cognitive abilities. He's distracted.
Right.
And what struck me in this interview with the Beacon was that his focus is not on the campaign. When he was asked questions about the policy positions of his rivals, he has no idea what they are. Right. He's not paying attention to his challengers. He was asked about DeSantis's efforts to boot Students for Justice in Palestine chapters off college campuses. He was asked about Ramaswamy's shifting positions on Israel. And his response would be, oh, did he say that? Okay, what did he say? Tell me. On the one hand, he doesn't need to be aware of them. He's beating them in the polls right now by 20 to 30 points, depending on what state you're talking about. So he's paying them the attention perhaps that they merit right now. On the other hand, it is indicative that he is not tracking these things closely. His attention, I presume, one can't know, is on the court cases. So I take what you're saying, that like he's not laser focused on humiliating these guys in the way that he was before. But again, I think the frame of the piece is wrong, that I don't think it undercuts his attack on Biden's age. It's indicative of where his attention is. And I think a better frame of this would be like, to what extent where is Trump's focus right now, and how will that impact his campaign?
Well, I think it's not cognitive decline. The false equivalency is about cognitive decline. Trump's problem is he's unwell, right? Like he is not a well person, and his fuming and obsessions and
has not hurt. That's helped him though.
He pulled off the most astonishing upset in American political history, certainly of my lifetime and of recent memory, in 2016. But I would submit that a more rational, more disciplined Donald Trump would have won in 2020 and would be in a much better place to beat Joe Biden. I think that Donald Trump's breakthrough in the Republican nominating process in 2016 was because he was a fascinating media story, and he was loose and riffing and all of that stuff. But I don't think that his mental incapacity related to his ill mental health is an asset.
His breakthrough was also policy related in terms of his fearlessness in upending sacred cows on immigration and on trade. And I think that was vitally important and is an extension of his like mental state in certain ways. His absolute lack of regard for party leaders and their, what they think about things. And I think that was important, and it's a little bit hard to separate them.
Well, it is true that that is of a piece, and he co-opted an issue, all of that stuff. But
and can I just contrast that? Sorry to interrupt you to Ron DeSantis and where he is on foreign policy, where my sense is he's trying to really carefully triangulate between the rising isolationist tide in the party, the Vivek Ramaswamis, and the Nikki Haley's, the neocon light version of the party, where he is very sensitive to like, where should I be? Where are people? And Trump has no regard for that. And I think that was helpful to him before, and is an outgrowth of like this recklessness in a certain way. But I am just riffing.
It's funny you say that, because the Wall Street Journal has a piece. Headline: Why Trump's drastic plan to slash the government could succeed. Bum, bum, bum. Subhead: Republican presidential frontrunner wants to fire federal employees, assert control over independent agencies, and wrest spending authority from Congress. Well, let me tell you, you read this piece and it's kind of hilarious, because what they find there's a whole cottage industry of people who are trying to prepare for the second Trump term, people who came from his administration and the general collection of suck-ups who are grinding out policy around Washington and around the country. And what this piece basically does is collects the pipe dreams from, the Heritage Foundation or whatever that would be in Trump's administration, and says that and the premise is these people have worked up these plans. The Supreme Court is now conservative because of Trump, and they're going to be able to do all of these things. And here's the part that cracks me up. The part that cracks me up is this piece is predicated on the idea that Donald Trump returning to power will be laser focused on conservative priorities, that he will get in there and say, Russ Vought, thank you so much for working up this plan. Now we turn to fundamentally remaking the Article 2 powers of the presidency. If Donald Trump becomes president again, he will be laser focused on a lot of stuff, but it will not be advancing the Heritage Foundation's blueprints for changing government. In his first term, a lot of conservative stuff got done without, like, you can look at agencies like the FCC, you can look around Washington at the EPA, at the Interior Department, where conservatives, unknown to Trump before and mostly unknown to him during the presidency, were able to put a lot of policies into place that conservative think tanks had been working on. Donald Trump, if he returns to power, is not going to need or want the help of those people, right? If he manages to return to power, what did he say? I am your vengeance, right? If Donald Trump returns to power, he will staff his administration with people who will never tell him no and give him everything that he wants whenever possible. And the idea that it would be a bonanza for small government traditional conservatives is I understand why that would be that the drastic plan. It would be scary, and I think this piece is scaremongering and misguided. Why it would be scary to liberals or Democrats, but I don't think it at all addresses what the real thrust of Trump's presidency would be like and what the real challenges it would face as it confronted the Senate, Congress, and the new president's desire to punish his enemies.
Chris, let's talk about the new speaker and the coverage of him, Speaker Mike Johnson.
That guy.
There is obviously, there's no subtlety here, an effort in the mainstream media afoot to cast him as a crazy Christian lunatic. And I wonder how successful that's going to be, given that personality-wise, he doesn't come across like a Jim Jordan. He just doesn't have that kind of a personality. But this made me laugh out loud. I saw this piece in Politico magazine. The headline was, quote, it's a quote, "He seems to be saying his commitment is to minority rule. A Q&A with historian Kristen Kobes-Dumez on the Christian nationalist ideas that shaped House Speaker Mike Johnson." This also, of course, gets at the rot in academia. And the piece says, on Wednesday, when newly elected House Speaker Mike Johnson gave his first speech in that role, he quoted British statesman and philosopher G.K. Chesterton, who once said, "America is the only nation in the world that is founded upon a creed, and that it is," quote, "listed with almost theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence." Quote, "That is the creed that has animated our nation since its founding, and has made us the great nation that we are," Johnson said. Back to the author's words. That line caught the attention of Kristen Kobes-Dumez, a historian who specializes in evangelical Christianity and politics. The idea that America is founded on a creed is a common one among evangelicals. And it was a sign to her that Johnson adheres to a worldview that can be described as Christian nationalist.
G.K. Chesterton, Christian nationalist. That is.
And Johnson, Christian nationalist, because he believes America was founded upon a creed. I truly think that if you put Johnson's statement to Americans in a poll, it would get about 90% approval rating, which is why I think this effort to portray him this way is going to fail.
Abraham Lincoln, Christian nationalist. This is a doozy. Look, Johnson is, well, I think this next item speaks to it. This is also from Politico and relates back. Speaker Johnson taps veteran GOP operative as chief spokesperson. Mike Johnson has tapped veteran Republican operative Raj Shah to build and oversee his communications operation, according to a person familiar with the move. Shah is expected to serve as Johnson's deputy chief of staff. Previously spent 4 years as senior vice president for public affairs at the Fox Corporation. Now, you may remember Raj Shah from the Dominion lawsuit against Fox and some things that came out about his advice at the network and all of that stuff. And it puts in context how bad Mike Johnson's communications effort is here. So Mike Johnson wins the speakership. Nobody knows beans about Mike Johnson, right? He's a fairly obscure lawmaker whose only claim to fame was that he led the effort. He spearheaded the legal effort to try to help Donald Trump steal a second term. He was there, and he grabbed it and went for it. That gave him credibility with the Freedom Caucus and the other people who had helped Trump. But because he was sort of a blank canvas, even his countenance, even his face, even has this sort of neutral energy in his affect, and did not have a lengthy history, and was from Louisiana, Steve Scalise's home state, that mainstream Republicans said, okay, we'll live with this guy. He could do it. So you have this opportunity when you win the speakership. Who are you going to do your first interview with? This is a big moment, right? And where did he go? What did he do? He went to Sean Hannity, right? You want to talk about preaching to the choir, right? So with the help of Hannity, with the help of right-wing media, they took out Kevin McCarthy and they blocked other mainstream Republicans from becoming speaker. You have this opportunity. And so he goes on Sean Hannity, and that's where he drops his quote about, people say, what does Mike Johnson believe in? I say, pick up the Bible. You pick up the Bible and it's in there. Well, I'm pretty sure that the Bible doesn't have anything on the alternate minimum tax. I'm pretty sure that the Bible doesn't hold clear on Ukraine.
Chris, we got to get you to McLean.
And I'm pretty sure that the Bible doesn't hold about what we're supposed to do about Ukraine. It was such a misstep, and when he should have tried to use the new celebrity to leverage into a new thing. And look, Mike Johnson, that Politico piece is unfair and mean-spirited and all of that stuff. But I got to tell you, so far, what he's doing, and with the hiring of a Fox guy, with all of that stuff, this is not the way to be. And I will also say, I don't know what will have all transpired by the time this airs, but let's be clear. His path to success runs through delivering on a promise to make the House work its will, to restore regular order and do all of that, which is attractive to many groups, including a lot of Democrats in Congress. But over the next, 2 months, he's going to have a lot of rocky road to travel, in which he's going to have to flex his authority as speaker. If he can't count on the same right-wing folks who got him the job to back him now, if he has to suck up to them now, it will not go well.
I'm going to push back on that, in that I think Raj Shah, who I don't believe has started his job with the speaker yet, I believe he starts next week, was a smart hire for him. I worked with Raj closely when I was covering the Trump White House, and found him to be one of the honest brokers in that communication shop. And again, I was working at Politico in the mainstream, and found Raj to be really someone you could work with. And Raj left Fox after the Dominion stuff. I do think he is a voice of sanity who has contacts in the right wing and in the mainstream. The question, I think, is, will the speaker listen to counsel and guidance from somebody who has been through real communications crises, and how much will he take counsel here? But I think Raj is a smart hire for him, and from a press perspective, I found him to be an honest broker, someone with good instincts, and someone who you can really work with.
Well, I'll disagree, but then again, I read the memos, so I observe a very different character in Raj Shah. So we'll see what Johnson does.
Chris, that brings us to our facile file.
So good. This is the best one ever. Okay, so clickbait Washington Post headline. And I saw it. It made me open it. It worked. Years into a climate disaster, these people are eating the unthinkable. Now, if I say eating the unthinkable, what would you think? What's the first thing you would think of?
Bugs.
I went all the way to cannibalism, right? I was like, unthinkable. What's unthinkable? I could think of a lot that people, would eat, but what is the taboo? What is the thing that our mind would not even consider? And do you know what the answer actually is?
Well, I read the article, so I do.
Water lilies. That is, they're bitter, they're hard to digest, and they require hours of manual labor. Now, I am not in any way minimizing the suffering of the people of South Sudan. It is a nightmare that the people of South Sudan have endured true.
Can we also just note, like, I don't think South Sudan was like a thriving place
No,
with
no,
a,
right.
Michelin star food culture before the quote unquote climate
The
disaster.
rubbed kale salad was not on.
Yeah.
was not on the menu.
The sushi was on point.
Was not on the menu. So here's the double whammy: clickbait, misleading, trash headline. And then it's a story about climate change. And it goes on and on about how climate change has made life worse in South Sudan. And I'm not here saying that the changes in the climate do not have negative consequences for poor people or anything like that. But what makes this piece so astonishingly facile is you have to read long and deep into this piece. You have to punish yourself by reading this piece on and on and on to get to the fundamental problem, which is the politics, the political system in South Sudan and the tyranny of its leadership and how the aid that people try to send to the South Sudanese. And all of this is stolen, misappropriated, abused. And they don't what's the story here is there's a lot of people who live in bad places, right? There's a lot of tough places where people are having to eat the equivalent of water lilies around the globe. What makes South Sudan different in many ways from some of them is the shattered politics and governance of the area. And it's passed off. I don't know that I'll be able to find it, but the idea that this is a climate change story instead of what it really is, which is a story about how political dysfunction, political corruption, and bad government fall hardest on poor people. This was Washington Post. No one will ever be able to unseat you as the most facile of all publications.
Chris, it is time for our style section.
Yes.
And we have such a wonderful piece. Headline, quote, "Sorry for being so blunt. An actress apologizes for making a fat joke on TV more than a decade ago. Have we lost our minds?"
Tell America who Emily Blunt is.
Emily Blunt, a movie star who recently prostrated herself after being savaged online for fat shaming. Her offense, describing a woman who served her at Chili's as enormous. She unleashed the epithet more than a decade ago on The Jonathan Ross Show, a UK television program where she was appearing to flog her latest film. Mr. Ross, who like Ms. Blunt is British, was whooping it up with his guest about lavish food portions in the New World, joking that, quote, "You can see why so many of our American friends are enormous." Ms. Blunt joined in with her account of the meal at Chili's. "The girl that was serving me was enormous," without specifying which outpost in the nationwide chain she patronized, and she mimicked the woman's accent. "Did anyone ever tell you you look a lot like Emily Blunt?" Host and audience laughed along. Entertaining and unkind, of course. Ragingly offensive? Come on, the Wall Street Journal writes. When the interview aired in 2012, it didn't raise eyebrows. But after a clip of the chat reverberated recently around the internet, commentators let loose a shower of vitriol that made enormous sound benign by comparison, slamming Ms. Blunt as fat-phobic, horrible, and far worse. The actor swiftly issued a fulsome apology in a statement to People magazine. "I'm appalled that I would say something so insensitive," she added. "I'm sorry for any hurt caused. I was absolutely old enough to know better." Chris, I don't think we've made progress in a decade.
I don't think we've made progress in a decade. And the idea of, I get it. If I was her publicist, if I was her Raj Shah, I would say, no pun intended, you got to eat it, right? Like, just the people are coming after you, because her major error here is laughing at her audience, right? She's being mean to the people that she wants to go see her movies. She's being, as Brits have a tendency to do, laughing and japing at hickish Americans. So that was her offense. So she had to just say, "I'm the worst. I'm sorry. Please excuse me for my insensitivity." I understand the thinking behind that. But the idea that things, what's the word they use? Surfacing it's like, oh, okay, you mean someone just went through old clips and found something and they're going to beat you over the head with it, take it out of context. It is the tyranny of the mob, that's for sure.
And finally, in the style section, this was hilarious. Puck News had Halloween costume recommendations for how to dress like top media executives.
Amazing.
And we're going to link that in the show notes. But they had a David Zaslav costume and a Gwyneth Paltrow costume and so on. So it's obviously a visual item, but we will link it in our newsletter. The Zaslav one was amazing.
The two sets of glasses,
the
jean jacket. Yes, excellent. Canadian tuxedo, excellent. 10 out of 10.
Chris, that brings us to our obsessions of the week, where we break down the stories we can't get out of our heads. And mine was a Free Beacon piece written by a Yale sophomore, Sahar Tartak, who wrote an op-ed for the Yale Daily News on October 12th, referring to Hamas's raping and beheading of Israelis. And 2 weeks later, on October 20th, found, without her knowledge or any consultation with her, that the editors of the Yale Daily News had appended a correction to her piece, noting that the references to Hamas's atrocities had been removed from it, and a correction appended noting that they could not be substantiated. And she wrote in the Beacon, the Yale Daily News editor-in-chief told me that at the time my piece was published, 5 days after Hamas carried out a pogrom reminiscent of the bloodiest 19th century atrocities, there was swirling unsubstantiation of the rape and beheading claims. I just will note, unsubstantiation is not a word, as far as I'm aware. Unlike the Nazis, who took pains to hide their actions, Hamas broadcast them to the world. Live videos of the horrors were circulating on the internet and on broadcast television on the day of the attack. For those with lingering doubts or inclined to split hairs about whether victims were beheaded or simply found with severed heads, international reporters were on the ground in Israel within 48 hours to chronicle the atrocities. I wish I could write off my classmates' foibles as youthful stupidities, but I see professional journalists making the same mistake. It's not an accident. The Yale Daily News is their breeding ground, and in a few years, the editors who wrote and approved that correction will go on to careers in the mainstream press, which is chock full of Yale Daily News editors and reporters. Take the New York Times, where the author of the flagship daily newspaper, the paper's diplomatic and Supreme Court correspondents, and the host of the paper's hit podcast, The Daily, are all Yale Daily News alumni. And she concluded, noting that the pipeline from the Ivy League newspapers into the mainstream media is full of sewage. And hours after, we sent a request for comment to the editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News, Annika Seth, who is, of course, head of diversity, equity, and inclusion board at the Yale Daily News. She did not respond to our request for comment, but hours later, the paper issued a correction of its correction in a mealy-mouthed, impossible to comprehend statement. But this was such a microcosm of what is happening on all college campuses. And I really did want to recognize the courage of a young lady who just started her sophomore year, who is taking on the college journalistic establishment.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. That was quite a doozy. Okay, my obsession is about cynicism and knowingness in political coverage. And I wrote a piece. Mike Pence dropped out of the race. It didn't have much effect on the race because he hadn't had much effect on the race in recent weeks. And he was already he was bowing to reality when he dropped out. And there was a Politico piece that was 3,896 words long. I had to put it into a Word document to get the count because it was so long I couldn't believe it. And the headline originally was "Inside Mike Pence's Sad, Dwindling Presidential Campaign." And the author of the piece congratulated himself because he said the piece went viral, or a photo from the piece went viral, reducing Pence to a punchline on late night TV. And I thought, what a turd. Like, like, the guy's already out, man. What do you want? He already quit. And bragging that you were able to make Mike Pence into a punchline on late night TV. Mike Pence made himself into a punchline on late night TV because he was the antithesis of everything that you're supposed to be in American public life to be cool, right? He's the opposite of all that stuff. He's square, he's boring, his rules about meetings with women and lunches with women and stuff, all of it is so like 50s Squaresville. You think Jimmy Kimmel needed help from Politico to dump on Mike Pence? No. But what it got me thinking about was this. We should try to have in the media a little more a little step back, right? Instead of being cynical. Look, Mike Pence had huge structural problems in his campaign, but we don't know what's going to work, right? We don't know what's going to work. We don't know what people are going to like and what people are not going to like. And I read a piece this week about actually, Nikki Haley has to step aside because Ron DeSantis is the one who has to go blah, 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 blah. You don't know what voters want. Voters don't know what voters want. Voters are making up their mind. The things that we pour over in exit polls and opinion research that talk about why voters chose who they chose, most of that is post facto reasoning. Most of that is stuff that they come up with to explain the unconscious choice, the feeling that they have about somebody and why it led them to where it led them. And there is an archness and a cynicism about all of this stuff. Just let them run, right? Just let them run and see what happens.
Chris, that brings us to my favorite time of the week, which is reader mail. And we have a note from Mark M. in Texas who writes, "On the lighter side, dearest wretches, my two new favorite words, bamboccioni and mamoni."
Aye.
And he links an article from CNN. Parasites. Mother wins court case to evict two sons in their 40s. And that article quotes, "The two sons, described in court papers by their mother as parasites, have been living in the family apartment without contributing financially or helping around the house, according to the complaint filed by the woman who has not been named in the Tribunal of Pavia District Court. Both men are employed." The court documents state, it goes on to say, "This is not the first time mamoni, an Italian term used to describe adult men who are too dependent on their mothers, has cropped up in the legal system. In 2020, Italy's Supreme Court ruled against a 35-year-old man who worked as a part-time music teacher who still expected financial support from his parents after he argued that he could not support himself on an annual salary of 20,000 euros, $21,100. But what does bamboccioni mean?
Big babies.
I
love it. Love it.
And so Mark writes, "A mother's love does have limits, it seems, at least for a 75-year-old woman in the northern Italian city of Pavia who won a court order after suing to have her sons evicted."
Bamboccioni, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. 10 out of 10.
And Chris, that now brings us to your favorite time of the week, which is when I am forced to say something nice. But as always, you must lead us by example.
Okay. I hate the way we board airplanes. I hate it. And everybody hates it, but we have an answer. Wall Street Journal, the astrophysicist who has a better way to board airplanes. And United, which I have complained on this podcast about the way that they board their airplanes, is going to embrace some of it. You should read the piece. You can get the details. But here's the précis. Quote, "The first person to board is a single aisle jet like a Boeing 737, is the passenger in the window seat on the last row." Let's say that's